smell of wood smoke and cinnamon rolls hit me the moment I turned onto Maple Creek Road, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is what Thanksgiving is supposed to feel like. My son was buckled into the back seat, still in his good clothes from the school concert the night before, holding the ceramic dish I'd spent 2 days making from scratch. Sweet potato casserole, my grandmother's recipe, the one she'd written out for me in her slanted handwriting on an index card I still kept in my kitchen drawer. Owen had asked me 3 times on the drive over whether Grandma Betty would like the marshmallows on top, because he'd been very particular about arranging them himself. She's going to love them, I told him. She loves everything you do. He accepted that with the kind of easy confidence that only 8-year-olds have, and went back to watching the bare November trees blur past his window. My grandmother's house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, a white 2-story farmhouse with dark green shutters, and a porch that wrapped all the way around the front. She'd lived there for 41 years. She used to say the porch was the whole point of the house, that a house without a porch was just a box. There were cars already parked along the grass when we pulled in, which meant my brother had arrived ahead of us. My brother and his wife, Simone. I should have paid attention to the way my stomach tightened when I saw their car. Owen was already unbuckling himself before I'd even put the car in park. I grabbed the casserole, told him to hold the door for me, and we walked up the porch steps together. I could hear voices inside, the warm mumble of a football game from the living room, the smell of turkey carrying all the way out to the cold air. I knocked twice and opened the door the way I always did because this was my grandmother's house and I had been walking to that door since I was 4 years old. Simone was standing in the hallway. She wasn't holding anything. She wasn't on her way somewhere. She was just standing there, and the look on her face when she saw me, it wasn't surprise. It was something deliberate. "Oh," she said. "I wasn't sure you were actually coming." "Grandma invited me," I said. I kept my voice level. I had practiced keeping my voice level around Simone. "Right," she folded her arms. "The thing is, we're doing kind of a smaller thing this year. More immediate family." I looked at her. I am immediate family. You know what I mean. I didn't move for a second. Owen had pressed himself slightly behind my leg, the way he did when he could feel tension in a room even if he didn't understand it. I put my free hand on his shoulder. "Can I talk to Grandma Betty?" I asked. "She's resting. She had a rough morning." "Then I'll wait." I drew Bile. Simone stepped slightly to the side, not enough to let me in, enough to block the hallway. "Nadia, I really think it would be better if—" "Better for who?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I intended, which was its own kind of anger. She didn't answer. She just looked at me with that particular expression she'd been giving me for 6 years, the one that said she'd already decided how this conversation was going to end. I stood there on my grandmother's porch, holding a casserole dish in my son's hand, and I thought about all the ways I could fight this. And then I looked down at Owen, who was watching me with those careful eyes, reading my face the way kids do when they're trying to figure out whether to be scared. "Okay," I said, and I turned around and walked back down the porch steps. I got Owen buckled in. I put the casserole on the floor of the passenger seat. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the car, staring at my hands on the steering wheel. Owen didn't say anything. He was 8, but he was wise in the way some children are. Old-souled and quiet, he waited. "Are we going home?" he finally asked. "I think so, buddy." "What about the marshmallows?" Something cracked open in my chest at that. "We'll make them again," I said. "Just for us." I started the car. We made it about half a mile down Maple Creek Road before my phone rang through the speakers. My grandmother's name on the screen. I pulled over. "Nadia." Her voice was sharp in a way I hadn't heard in years. Not the sharp of confusion or age, but the sharp she used when she meant business. When I was 12 and I lied about where I'd been after school, she'd use that voice. "You turn this car around right now." "Grandma, Gamma, I am 81 years old and I know exactly what is going on in my own house. You turn around and you come through the back door. Do you hear me? The back door. By the garden. I sat there with the blinker still on. Grandma, I don't want to cause a scene. The scene, she said, has already been caused. I just didn't know the full extent of it until about 10 minutes ago. A pause. Bring my Owen. And bring that casserole. I can smell it from here. She hung up. Owen's voice came from the back seat, very small and very hopeful. Are we turning around? Yeah, I said. We're turning around. My grandmother, Betty Louise Marsh, had been the organizing force of our family for as long as any of us could remember. She'd raised 2 kids mostly alone after my grandfather passed in the late 90s, my mother and my uncle. My mother had died when I was 19, a car accident on an icy highway in February, the kind of thing that didn't have any meaning or lesson in it. It just happened, and then everything was different. My uncle had moved to Phoenix 8 years ago and called on birthdays. That left me and my brother Elliot as the family who showed up. At least, that's how I'd thought about it. Elliot was 3 years older than me, broad-shouldered and easy-talking, the kind of man who made a good impression in the first 5 minutes, and then slowly revealed himself to be something else. I had loved him for most of my life. I had also spent most of my life adjusting my understanding of who he was. Simone came in when Elliot was 31. She was polished in a way that sometimes looked like elegance and sometimes looked like armor, and from the beginning she'd had opinions about how things should be done. Which holidays at whose house, which traditions to keep, which ones were due for retirement. She was efficient with her opinions. She slipped them in at moments when no one was quite ready to push back. My grandmother had welcomed her. She welcomed everyone. But I'd noticed over the years that Betty welcomed Simone in the particular way she welcomed things she was still figuring out. Warmly, carefully, watching. I pulled around to the back of the house and parked by the garden, bare and frost-touched now. The tomato cages still standing from the summer. The back door opened before I'd even gotten Owen out of the car. My grandmother stood in the doorway in her good blouse and her house slippers, and she looked exactly the way she always looked, compact and composed and absolutely certain of herself. She held the screen door open and looked at Owen. There he is, she said, and her voice went completely soft. Come here, you. Owen went to her without hesitation, and she put her arms around him and held him for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she straightened and looked at me over his head. Inside, she said, both of you. The kitchen was warm, and it smelled like everything Thanksgiving was supposed to smell like. She'd been cooking since early morning. I could tell by the number of dishes resting on the counter, covered in foil. She had Owen sit at the kitchen table and gave him a glass of apple cider and a task that involved counting the silverware, which he took very seriously. Then she looked at me. Sit down, Nadia. I sat. She sat across from me, folded her hands on the table, and was quiet for a moment. I need to tell you some things, she said, and I need you to let me tell them in the right order, because I've been holding on to pieces of this for a while now, and today made me realize I should have told you sooner. I nodded. She took a breath. You know that your grandfather left me this house outright. No complications, just mine. And you know that when I updated my will a few years back, I was very clear about how I wanted things divided. I knew in the general sense. She'd mentioned it once 2 or 3 years ago, that she wanted the house to go to whoever would actually live in it and care for it, and that she'd been thinking about what that meant. What I didn't know, she said, until very recently, was that Elliot and Simone had already taken steps to, let's say, influence that situation. I looked at her. What do you mean? She was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. A while back, maybe 2 years ago, I had a financial advisor. Man named Gerald, friend of your grandfather's, originally. He helped me with some accounts, some paperwork. I trusted him. She paused. Elliot introduced me to a new one. A cold feeling started in the back of my neck. The new one was very helpful, very attentive. He came to the house, he took care of everything, he made it very easy for me. He updated some documents for me. Or, I thought he was updating them. I thought I was signing what I'd always said I wanted. Grandma, Gamma. I found out last month, she said, steady and quiet, that the documents I signed 2 years ago were not what I understood them to be. The language had been changed. A power of attorney that I believed was limited and temporary had been significantly expanded, and the beneficiary arrangements on 2 of my accounts, not the house, thank God, but 2 accounts, had been revised. The room felt very still. Owen was counting forks at the other end of the table, completely absorbed. Revised how? I asked. Revised to list Elliot as sole beneficiary. Removing you. She held my gaze. I didn't sign those forms knowingly. The pages were slipped into a stack. Gerald. The original Gerald. He's the one who noticed when I called him this past October. He recognized something off about the documents when I mentioned them, and he looked into it. She set her jaw. He's the one who told me what I'd actually signed. I sat with that for a moment. The cold had moved from my neck into my chest. Does Elliot know you know? I asked. As of about 15 minutes ago, yes. A thin, precise smile crossed her face. He knows. She'd called Elliot into the dining room just before I arrived. She told him very quietly that she knew, that Gerald had gone through the paperwork with her, that she'd consulted an attorney, her own attorney, not the one the financial advisor had helpfully recommended, and that she understood exactly what had been changed and when. She told me Elliot had gone pale in a way she'd never seen before. He'd started explaining. There were reasons, there was context. She didn't understand how these things worked. He'd only been trying to protect her. She'd held up her hand. Elliot had gone quiet. Your grandfather didn't leave me this house and 40 years of his savings so that I would be managed, she told him. There in the dining room with the good china on the sideboard and the turkey in the oven and Simone standing in the doorway behind him. I'm not confused. I'm not fragile. And I am not available to be arranged. Then she'd excused herself, called me and told me to come through the back door. The attorney is coming next week, she said, looking at me across the kitchen table. We're undoing everything that was changed. The accounts go back to what I intended. Split equally between you and your brother, with your uncle receiving his portion as well. She paused, though I'll tell you honestly, I'm reconsidering Elliot's portion. Grandma, Gamma. I'm not saying permanently, I'm saying I'm reconsidering. She looked at her hands. What made me the most angry wasn't even the documents. It was today. The fact that he or she or both of them together decided that you weren't invited to Thanksgiving. In my house, without asking me. She looked up. I didn't know you'd been turned away until I looked out the window and saw your car leaving. Her voice didn't waver. But I saw something move behind her eyes that I hadn't seen there in a long time. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't know exactly what I was apologizing for. Maybe just that she'd had to see it. That any of it happened. Don't apologize, she said firmly. You didn't do anything wrong. You came to Thanksgiving with your boy, the way I asked you to, and you were treated like a stranger on my porch. She shook her head once. That ends today. She had me and Owen stay for dinner. Elliot and Simone stayed as well, because my grandmother was not the kind of woman who created dramatic exits. She was the kind who required everyone to sit at the same table and be decent to each other, at least on the surface. There was something almost old-fashioned about it, but also something clear-eyed. She wasn't keeping the peace for the sake of comfort. She was keeping it on her terms. Dinner was quiet in the particular way that dinners are quiet when too much has been said in the hours before, and no one has quite figured out how to return to normal. Elliot passed the rolls without making eye contact with me. Simone was very focused on her plate. Owen talked about his class's Thanksgiving play and the fact that he'd been cast as a turnip, which he felt was an underrepresentation of his talents, and my grandmother laughed in a way that filled the room. After dinner, while Owen was watching football in the living room with my grandmother's old tabby cat asleep across his legs, she sat beside me on the back porch. The cold had sharpened by evening, and we could see our breath. She was quiet for a long moment. Your mother would have been furious today, she finally said. I laughed before I could stop myself. It was the truest thing anyone had said all day. She would have, I agreed. She had no patience for smallness. She folded her hands in her lap. You got her patience. She would have walked away like you did, and then she would have come back through the back door. I looked at the bare garden, the frost-gray sky over the tree line. I almost didn't come back. I know. She turned and looked at me. I'm glad you did. We sat there for a while, not saying much. Inside, I could hear the television, Owen saying something, the tabby cat apparently demanding attention based on the small commotion. Grandma, I said, the documents, is it all going to be okay? Legally, I mean. Yes, she said without hesitation. Gerald is cooperating fully. He feels responsible, I think, for introducing the advisor in the first place. The attorney says the power of attorney can be revoked immediately. I've already signed the revocation, and the account beneficiary changes are being challenged on the basis that I did not give informed consent. She paused. It takes time. But yes, it will be okay. And Elliot? She was quiet for a moment. Elliot is my grandson, and I love him. But love doesn't mean unlimited, consequence-free access to my decisions. She looked out at the darkening yard. He needs to understand that. I nodded. I'm also writing a letter, she said. Not a legal one. Just a letter. About what I want. About what this family is supposed to look like. About who we are to each other. She glanced at me. I want you to read it before anyone else. I felt something shift in my throat. Okay, I said. You show up, Nadia. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was stating something about the weather. You've been showing up since you were 19 years old and you lost your mother and you still made it to Christmas, made it to every birthday dinner, made it today, even after being turned away from my front porch. That matters. That is not nothing. She put her hand over mine on the armrest between us. You are not invisible in this family. Not as long as I'm here. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my voice. We sat there until Owen came to the screen door and asked if he could have a second piece of pie, and my grandmother said yes before I could even weigh in, and he disappeared back inside with the satisfaction of a child who knows exactly which adult to ask. She squeezed my hand once, and then let go. Come on, she said, pushing herself up from the chair with the ease of someone who refuses to acknowledge that 81 is any different from 50. Let's go make sure he doesn't eat the entire pie. A week later, I sat in her attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon and listened as the revocation documents were formalized. Gerald was there, looking tired in a way that I thought probably had something to do with guilt. The attorney, a woman about my grandmother's age named June, walked through each document with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen most things and was no longer surprised by any of them. The power of attorney was revoked. The beneficiary changes were formally contested. My grandmother signed each page in her careful, slanted handwriting, and when it was done, she thanked June, thanked Gerald, and walked out into the November afternoon like she was simply checking something off a list. On the drive home, she told me she'd had a long conversation with Elliot the day before. She didn't tell me everything that was said. She told me that it was hard, and that he'd cried, and that she believed he understood, at least partially, what he'd done. She told me she wasn't closing the door on him, but she'd changed the locks on a few rooms. I thought that was a good way to put it. Owen was at school, so it was just the two of us at our kitchen table that afternoon. She made tea, and we sat with the gray November light coming through the window over the sink. And she showed me the letter she'd written. It was 4 pages, handwritten, starting with a sentence about what this house had meant to her for 41 years, and ending with something about what it meant to her that we were still all here, even after everything, even with all the complications of the people we'd become. She'd written my name in it. She'd written what I meant to her. She'd written about my mother, too, a paragraph that made me press my hands flat on the table to keep from crying in her kitchen. This isn't a legal document, she said. It won't hold up in court. It's just what I actually want, written down, so there's no confusion later about what I intended. I looked at her across the table. This woman who had weathered 40 years in this house, who had buried her husband and her daughter, who had kept making holidays and kept the porch lights on and kept showing up to every school concert and every birthday and every ordinary Tuesday that needed a person to show up. I'll make sure everyone sees it, I said. Good. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Now tell me how Owen's turnip performance went. I've been thinking about it all week. And I laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere uncomplicated, and I told her about the school play and the too big costume, and how Owen had ad-libbed a line at the end that made his teacher cover her mouth, and how he'd come off stage completely pleased with himself. And she listened to every word of it like it was the best story she'd heard in years. The light shifted. The tea went cold. Neither of us moved to leave. Some things, it turns out, you don't have to fight for loudly. You just have to keep showing up. Through the turned-away mornings and the backdoor arrivals and the long November afternoons. And eventually, the truth arranges itself at the table, right where it was always supposed to be. I keep thinking about the casserole dish sitting on the floor of my passenger seat as I drove away that morning. Sweet potato casserole with marshmallows my son had arranged himself, going nowhere. That image stays with me because it feels like a small, honest picture of what it's like to keep trying when trying doesn't seem to be enough. But here's what I've learned, and I learned it slowly, the hard way, across a lot of ordinary days that didn't feel ordinary at all. The people who try to shrink you are usually the ones most afraid of being seen clearly themselves. What Elliot and Simone did wasn't just about money or paperwork. It was about control. It was about rewriting a story so that certain people disappeared from it, and it almost worked, not because they were smarter, but because I was too willing to walk quietly away from doors that should have been open to me. My grandmother didn't let that happen, not because she was looking for a fight, but because she'd spent 81 years paying attention to the difference between what people say and what they actually do. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from a classroom. It comes from watching, from remembering, from refusing to let convenience rewrite what you know to be true. When Gerald called her in October and flagged those documents, she didn't panic. She didn't confront Elliot that same afternoon. She consulted her own attorney. She gathered what she needed. She waited until she was certain. That kind of clear-eyed steadiness, the ability to think before you act, to understand what you're actually looking at, is what protected everything she'd spent a lifetime building. And what protected me, really, was simpler than any legal document. It was just that I kept showing up. After my mother died when I was 19, I showed up for Christmas. I showed up for her birthday dinners. I showed up on Thanksgiving with a ceramic dish and an 8-year-old who wanted to know if the marshmallows were evenly spaced. There's a kind of quiet endurance in that, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, just the plain, unglamorous persistence of being present when it would have been easier to stop. That persistence, I think, is what made it possible for my grandmother to say with complete certainty, "This one shows up. This one I can trust." The things that were taken, the account changes, the expanded power of attorney, the years of quiet maneuvering. They couldn't take the thing that actually mattered. They couldn't take the 40 years of history between me and the woman who raised the woman who raised me. They couldn't take Owen's easy way of walking into her kitchen like it was the safest place on earth. Those things don't live in paperwork. They live in the accumulated weight of every ordinary day you chose to be there. I'm not angry at Elliot the way I maybe should be. I'm something more complicated than angry. I'm sad for the version of him that thought this was necessary, that believed shrinking someone else was the only way to make sure there was enough. There's always been enough. There would have been enough without any of it. What I want Owen to understand, someday when he's old enough to hear it, is that how you treat people when there's nothing obvious to gain is the truest thing about you. Betty saw that. She saw it clearly. And in the end, that was the only document that needed to be signed.